Hi everybody, this is Andy. Welcome to Med School EU. And today we've got a very exciting day because it's another wonderful day teaching biology. And it's a special day because we finally get to learn about the physiology of animals and humans. And it's also our last topic in this dreadful biology section. So today we are going to talk about the animal tissues. I'm going to break down this first topic into two parts because it is a lengthy topic and we're going to cover it in two separate videos. And this is a really exciting last topic as it discusses the physiology of humans, which is something that we will be doing for our entire career as medical doctors. All right, so first let's do our classification of systems. This is something very basic you should have learned in middle school. However, I think a lot of times some of the very basic concepts are the ones that we get wrong on the exam. So we must know that there's a classification of systems beginning with cells, then going over to tissues, then the organs, organ systems, and then the entire organism. For example, skin. Skin has various tissues, it has various cells, and skin is an organ. So there could be some tricky wording, some tricky questions, but just go through several examples of types of questions with systems, and you should get the general grasp of what is classified as a cell, what is classified as a tissue of cells, and so on. So primarily today, we are going to discuss the types of tissues and going to go over some examples of those. So first of all, we have four different types of tissues. We've got epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. And those are the four primary types of tissues in the human body and animals as well. So we are going to discuss each one in detail, and we are going to go over how each one works, where they are located, and what's their main function. So first, let's begin with epithelial tissue. And an example of epithelial tissue is going to be the skin. The most fundamental function of epithelial tissue is going to be physical protection. So in physical tissue, it's not going to be just skin protecting from the outside, but it protects both the surfaces exposed internally and externally from mechanical and chemical and physical injury, or even injury due to dehydration. So all of those things, the whole purpose of epithelial tissue is for physical protection. So first, we're going to label a couple of layers of tissues. So this thin one right here that is squished, this is most notably going to be skin or inner linings of the kidney, for example, or inner lining of the stomach. But here we're just going to label types of epithelial tissues that we have. So this one is called simple squamous. And most notably, the simple squamous is located on the skin. Now, the next one is simple cuboidal. So these are all going to be just simple. This is going to be cuboidal. Simple cuboidal. And this one's going to be simple columnar. And this last one is going to be stratified. So it's not simple, it's stratified. And why it's squamous? Because we always look at the top few layers here to distinguish whether it's squamous or cuboidal or columnar. As you can see here, this is stratified cuboidal because the top layer is a cuboidal shape. And this last one is called pseudostratified columnar. Before we go into the details of what each one of these does and their main functions, where they're located, we're going to go over the rest of the functions of the epithelial tissue. So physical protection is definitely the main function, but it also functions in absorption, in sensations, and secretions. So now let's discuss all of these terms and where they're located and their specific functions. So simple squamous is just a single layer of squamous epithelium. It is very delicate, and it is specialized to allow movement of molecules across the cell. So this is specialized, and it's single layered, and most prominently you would see this in the alveoli. And why the alveoli? Well, it has to be very thin in order for molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide to pass through without any trouble. And that's going to be done through this simple squamous. It's typically found in the inner lining of blood vessels as well. So that's called the endothelium. It's found in the alveoli, as I mentioned, and it's also found in the abdominal cavity. Next one is the simple cuboid, and the primary function of simple cuboid is going to be to absorb fluids. And this happens across both ways of its surface. And the most prominent example of this would be the nephron in the kidney, because the nephron is our filtering organ of the blood, and it absorbs lots of fluids when it travels across the membrane. Now, simple columnar, this elongated one, would most prominently exist in digestive system, because its primary function is going to be absorption and secretion, so to absorb. And stratified squamous is going to be just layers of simple squamous, and most predominantly this would be on the skin, so its function would be protection. And we are also going to discuss the epidermis and just the skin, the tissue, and the types of cells that exist in skin tissue. So first, it's important to label the top part here, as these are not live cells, they are dead cells, and these are keratinocytes. So label these as dead. So these are dead cells that are on the surfaces of our skin that are there for protection. Now, of course, just underneath here, the ones with the nucleus are going to be live keratinocytes. Now, this one right here, this cell that kind of protrudes everywhere, this is called a Langerhans cell, and their main function is to maintain immunity. They would basically decide the immune response that will be used in case there's a pathogen that comes through the dead and alive keratinocytes. Now, this one right here, also labeled at the basal layer, this one's going to be called the Merkel cell. Merkel. And the importance of Merkel cells is they receive the sensations of touch. So if something was to touch the epidermis, if something was to touch the skin, the Merkel cells are the ones that are going to receive that sensation and pass it on to the nerves. And this last one here on the side is going to be a melanocyte. Melanocyte. Now again, these labels are going to change based on the diagram that you look at, but the most important thing about is knowing the type of cells that exist, exactly where they exist. So the Merkel cells exist on the basal layer, which is the layer just underneath the epidermis. You need to know keratinocytes exist on the very top with the dead keratinocytes protecting us. The Langerhans cells are going to be the cells that kind of mesh around, and they're going to be producing the immune response in case there is an attack by a pathogen. And melanocytes are the pigment cells. So pigment cells. So they're the cells that are responsible for the color of our skin. Next, we are going to discuss connective tissue. And there's 4 different types of connective tissue. There's connective tissue proper, which we're going to label and look at the diagram. There's cartilage, bone, and blood. So cartilage and bone, they're also called supporting connective tissue. So these are the 4 major types of connective tissue in our bodies. Mesenchyme, so there's something called mesenchyme. Mesenchyme is basically a cell. It's the embryological connective tissue. It's a cell that eventually develops into all these types of cartilage, bone, blood, connective tissue proper. Mesenchyme is the beginning of all that. It's the embryological stem cell, basically. So the functions of connective tissue are to support, bind, so they bind to surfaces, store, so storage, transport, again, blood does transportation, protection, it's also in protection, bone, cartilage, all associated with protection. And the more specialized would be the immune protection function. So first, let's discuss connective tissue proper. And connective tissue proper is divided into two types. There's loose, and there's dense. All right, so we are first going to discuss the areolar tissue, which is part of the loose connective tissue proper. So I know these terms are confusing for now, but just stick with me. I'm going to explain what these are and the purpose of them, and then everything's going to be loud and clear. So the image right here is basically our areolar tissue. It's tissue that is sometimes thought of as a prototype for that loose connective tissue, because it is a sample of all the different types of cells and fibers found in connective tissue. So connective tissue is made up of all different kinds of cells and fibers, and it's kind of like a mesh of everything. Here, we're going to label a lot of these structures, and we're going to go over a little bit about their significance and why they're part of connective tissue. But there are three types of connective tissue proper loose. There is areolar tissue, adipose tissue, and reticular tissue. So areolar tissue, which is the one that we will be discussing here, is a widespread design of connective tissue. So why I have chosen to discuss areolar, because it kind of encompasses everything that is part of connective tissue. It's the least specialized, and it holds water, and it's most often surrounds capillaries. So as you can see here, there's a blood vessel there, there's a blood vessel there. So if you could imagine, if we do a cross-section of part of our body, so for example, you do a cross-section of the arm, and you would have blood vessels running through. Of course, these are blood cells. And all around, there would be all kinds of different cells, all kinds of different meshes around that would be supporting it. And that's the connective tissue that we are talking about, because it kind of connects all the different types of systems together. It's kind of everything that exists in between all the cells and in between all the different organs and all the different organ systems. So that filling of our bodies is basically connective tissue. So first of all, the biggest part about all of this is this area that's kind of shaded over here. This area that's underneath all of this. That area is called ground tissue. And another very important part of connective tissue is called fibroblasts. The significance of fibroblasts is that they are part of areolar tissue that produce protein fibers and ground substance. So fibroblasts are the ones that lay down this network of ground substance, and they also produce protein fibers. So they produce things like collagen. So all of these large vessels here, they're collagen. And the function of collagen is that they are strong, flexible, and resistant fibers that protect cells from physical damage. Now, they also produce elastic fibers, and elastic fibers would be the ones that are these blue ones, these darker ones. These are elastic fibers. They're also elastin proteins that allows for stretch and recoil. So if you are to stretch your arm, for example, these elastic fibers is what's going to allow you to stretch the arm, but it's also going to recoil back once you put the arm back in its original unstretched phase. And finally, it produces, so fibroblasts also produce reticular fibers. And reticular fibers are made up of collagen protein, so same as this large protein right here, but it's a different type than the white fibers. It's tough, but it is very flexible, and it forms a branching or like this lattice network that has been shown here. And it's found in organs like spleen and the lymph nodes. It has a special function in its immune response that is way out of the scope of this course. So after epithelial cells, after our epidermis is broken through, so if we have a pathogen, a virus or a bacteria that has, there's a cut and they break through the epithelium, the next line of defense is going to be our connective tissue. And connective tissue has many ways to produce a defensive response. We got lymphocytes, macrophages, so this one is the macrophage. We also got our mast cells that produce a response. We got a lymphocyte, so this one right here we'll label as a lymphocyte. And we are going to talk about the immune response in way greater detail than this. We're just labeling the different cells. And we could label this one as the plasma cell. So these all play the ones in blue, they all play a major role in immune response to a pathogen. Next part of connective tissue is cartilage. So let's discuss cartilage a little bit. And cartilage, there's three types. There's hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. So hyaline cartilage is the most common type of cartilage. It is a high concentration of fine and thin collagen fibers. It is basically the precursor to the skeletal system, as it is located in the epiphyses of the long bones, so the very end of long bones, and it gives them that glassy surface. So if you have seen a bone that's typically like this glassy surface that's on the tip of each side is called the epiphyses. Epiphyses, and that is where hyaline cartilage is typically located. Now, some examples of hyaline cartilage would be the nasal cartilage, the trachea. A lot of trachea has hyaline cartilage. The connection of ribs to sternum, they all contain hyaline cartilage in order to facilitate those connections. Now, looking at elastic cartilage, it is very similar to hyaline cartilage, but with a predominant number of elastic fibers, making this cartilage very flexible and resilient to pressure and force. It has an outer covering called the perichondrium. So the most important thing is to just know it has a higher level of elastin. It's just these fibers that allow the cartilage to stretch. Some examples of where you could find elastic cartilage would be the ear is elastic cartilage. As you can see, it's very mushy and squishy, and it's very movable. And also the epiglottis. And you will learn about epiglottis once we talk a little bit about the anatomy. And finally, fibrocartilage is the chondrocytes and the collagen fibers are arranged in parallel rows. So everything is arranged in parallel. This is very good at absorbing shock and resisting compression. It is most commonly found between discs, the menisci of the knee, cartilage in between there that's called the menisci that allows for the two bones to move between each other without much friction. And however, fibrocartilage is not covered with an outer layer of perichondrium, meaning that with compression, there could be damage to this layer. So if there is movement against this layer of menisci, that's why you see a lot of meniscus tears, and they're not repairable. The thing about cartilage to understand is that there's not a lot of blood or nutrients really going to cartilage. This tissue is not supplied immediately with nutrients like oxygen and food that is able to metabolize it and be able to repair its cells. Cartilage is not repairable. It's typically repaired through surgery because you would have to replace the broken cartilage with a new cartilage from another part of the body. So in the last part of this video, we are going to discuss bone anatomy. So in this long bone, we're going to label some of the most important structures. And as we discussed, the top part here that lines the epiphysis, so this is going to be epiphyseal plate, or I guess the epiphyses. Epiphyses. And lining these epiphyseal ends is going to be hyaline cartilage. Now this line right here that creates this division is where a lot of the growth of the bone happens, and that line is called epiphyseal line. Now this part that is closer to the diaphysis side, this part right here is going to be the red bone marrow. Red. And in this red bone marrow, it's extremely important to know that the function of it is to produce red blood cells, platelets, and white blood cells, because that is where the stem cells are formed, and that is where the stem cells are going to be used to create a variety of other blood cells. Now, the outer surface, the outer part of this bone is called periosteum, and the name of this long bone is going to be called compact bone. And inside the diaphyses is going to be the yellow bone marrow. In the yellow bone marrow, we have mesenchyme stem cells, and they produce cartilage, they produce fat, and they produce bone. So yellow bone marrow aids in the storage of fat in cells called adipocytes. And the main function of this yellow bone marrow is to provide the growth or the breakdown of cells, which we are going to discuss next. So when you break a bone and you are given a cast after realigning the bones have to come together and grow new bone cells, so to speak, in order to repair the damage. So the repair of the damage happens with a balance of these fibroblasts and fibroclasts. Fibroblasts and fibroclasts are cells that break down bone if needed and create bone if needed. So fibroblasts, so the blasts, they lay down bone. They make bone. And fibroclasts, they break down bone. Break down bone tissue. And it's important to note that we need both. We need fibroclasts and we need fibroblasts. Later, we are going to learn about the balance of calcium within the body, and it is strictly regulated by these fibroclasts and fibroblasts as to how much calcium we're going to have in the blood, because the more bone you break down, the more calcium you are going to have. So this concludes our lecture for today, the first part of animal tissues. I hope this gives you a brief introduction into the types of tissues we have, and we have discussed in details the epithelial tissue. And further on, we're going to finish connective tissue and the rest, including muscle and nervous tissue.